Take off the apron and get out. People come here to eat, not to be served by charity cases. The new manager said it loud, right in the middle of the lunch rush, loud enough that every table at Rosie's Diner went quiet and turned to watch him fire the woman in front of them. Keisha Brooks didn't argue. She'd learned a long time ago that arguing with a man who signed your paycheck was a luxury she could not afford, not with her mother's medicine due Friday, not with the eviction notice already taped to her door. She untied her apron with steady hands, even as her face went hot, and she folded it neatly and set it on the counter, because her mother had raised her to walk out of any room with her head up, no matter how hard they shoved her toward the door. What the manager didn't know, what nobody chewing their sandwiches in that diner knew, was that 6 years ago, on the worst night of her own life, this same quiet woman had given a broken stranger her last $40, a hot plate of food, and the coat off her own back. That she had sat with him until the shaking stopped. That she had talked a man off the edge without ever once knowing his name. And what Keisha didn't know was that the stranger had spent every one of those 6 years looking for her. That he was now one of the most powerful men in the city, and that the long black car pulling into the diner lot right now was his. Before this man finally says out loud what this woman did for him 6 years ago, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand why a billionaire was about to walk into a roadside diner looking for a waitress, you have to understand Keisha Brooks. And you have to understand that the woman being humiliated over a folded apron was, pound for pound, the most generous person most people would ever meet, and had nothing left to show for it. She was 34. She worked doubles at Rosie's and picked up cleaning jobs on her days off, and every dollar of it went the same place, to her mother. Pearl Brooks was 62 and sick, a bad heart, a worse kidney, a cabinet full of pill bottles that cost more each month than the rent did. Keisha had moved her mother in 2 years back when Pearl couldn't manage the stairs anymore, and since then, Keisha's whole life had narrowed to a single equation she could never quite make balance. The medicine, the rent, the lights, the bus fare, the co-pays, all of it stacked against a waitress's wage and a tip jar. Her days had a shape worn smooth by repetition. Up at 5 to get Pearl's pills sorted into the little plastic day boxes, to check her mother's ankles for the swelling that meant a bad day coming, to make the oatmeal the way Pearl liked it, and sit with her while she ate, even when it meant Keisha skipped her own breakfast to make the bus. Then the long shift on her feet. Then the bus home in the dark. The second job, if there was one, the bills spread on the kitchen table like a hand of cards she kept losing. She did it without complaining, because complaining didn't pay anything, and because her father had taught her that you carry what you're given, and you keep your face kind while you carry it. And here's the thing about Keisha that the whole diner knew, and Greg Dolan refused to see. She carried other people's weight too, even when she had no room left for her own. There was Earl, 81, a widower on a thin check who came in most afternoons and made 1 cup of coffee last an hour, because his apartment was cold and quiet and the diner had people in it. Keisha kept his cup full and never rang the refills. There was the young mother who came in, frazzled with a toddler, and not quite enough for both their meals. Keisha had a way of miscounting the bill in her favor. There was the trucker who tipped in stories instead of dollars, and the teenager who studied in the back booth because home wasn't safe. Keisha saw all of them. That was her gift. The one nobody pays you for. She saw the people the world had decided not to look at, and she made them feel, for the length of a coffee, like somebody was glad they'd come in. It cost the diner almost nothing. It was, in fact, the reason half those regulars came at all. But to a man like Dolan, brought in with a spreadsheet and a mandate to tighten things up, kindness that didn't ring through the register was just theft with a smile. And Keisha Brooks was a line item that needed correcting. A normal day for Keisha went like this. She'd be on the floor by 6, refilling sugar caddies before the breakfast rush, already running the numbers in her head. How many tables, how good the tips might be, whether today would be a day she could put 20 toward the pharmacy, or whether it all had to go to the electric. She knew her regulars' orders before they sat down. She knew which trucker was going through a divorce and which night shift nurse was about to fall asleep in her booth and needed the coffee strong. She worked through her own lunch most days, eating a few cold fries standing up in the back so she wouldn't lose a table. Her feet, by the end of a double, were a steady throb she'd stopped noticing years ago. And then the bus home in the dark, and Pearl's pills, and the bills on the table, and 4 or 5 hours of sleep, and up again at 5. It was a small life, by the measures the world uses. No one was ever going to write an article about a waitress who gave away coffee. But Keisha had built something inside that small life that no spreadsheet could see. She had made herself the one warm, reliable thing in a lot of cold mornings for a lot of lonely people. The regulars didn't tip her well because they couldn't, most of them. They tipped her in being known. And for a woman who'd lost her father and her apartment and was one bad month from losing everything else, being the person who saw the invisible was the one wealth she had left. Greg Dolan was about to fire her for it. He had no idea he was about to fire her into the exact spot where 6 years of her own buried kindness was waiting to come back around. That morning, the math had finally come up short. The notice on the door gave her 30 days. The pharmacy had started asking, gently, when she could settle the balance. And now, on top of all of it, the new manager, a man named Greg Dolan, who'd been brought in to tighten things up, and had decided that a kind word to a struggling regular was wasted time, and that Keisha gave away too many free coffees to people who looked like they needed one, had just fired her in front of a full house. Keisha picked up her purse. She didn't cry, she'd saved that for the bus. She told the line cook, who actually liked her, to take care of himself. And she walked toward the door of the only job standing between her mother and a dark apartment, and she thought, "The way you think when the bottom is falling out. Lord, I have given and given my whole life. When is a little of it going to come back?" She had no idea that the answer to that exact question was, at that exact moment, opening the door she was walking toward. But to understand what walked through that door, we have to go back. 6 years back, to a freezing night in the winter of 2020, to the worst stretch of Keisha Brooks's own life. Because the thing about Keisha, the thing that mattered, was that she didn't give from a place of plenty. She gave from empty. She always had. Back then she was 28, and everything was coming apart at once. Her father had died that fall, the steady one, the one who'd taught her that you measure a person by how they treat someone who can't do a thing for them. The grief had knocked her flat. She'd fallen behind on everything, lost the little apartment she'd been proud of, and moved into a rented room she could barely cover by working the closing shift at an all-night diner on the edge of town. The kind of place that fed truckers and insomniacs and people with nowhere warmer to be. That winter, Keisha had almost nothing. Some nights her own dinner was the toast she wasn't supposed to take. She was as close to the edge as a person gets without going over. And it was on one of those nights near 2 a.m, with sleet coming down sideways and the diner empty, that the bell over the door rang and a man came in who looked worse than she felt. He was maybe 44 then, though he looked older, soaked through, no coat in that cold, his expensive shoes ruined, a man who'd clearly once had money and clearly had none now. He sat at the counter and didn't order. He just stared at his own hands. Keisha had seen a lot of broken people come through that door at 2 a.m., but there was a particular stillness to this one that put a cold finger on her spine. It was the stillness of a person who has already decided something. She'd later learn his name was Daniel. That night he was just a man at the end of his rope, and Keisha Brooks, broke, grieving, running on toast and fumes, was the only other soul awake in the place. And Keisha was not, that winter, in any shape to be saving anybody. That's the part of this you have to feel to understand what she did. Her father had been gone 3 months. Walter Brooks, a maintenance man who'd worked 40 years and never once raised his voice and taught his daughter everything she knew about being a person, and the grief had hollowed her out. Some nights, alone on the long bus ride home, she cried without making a sound. She'd lost the apartment they had shared. She was behind on everything. She had exactly the $40 in her apron and 3 days until her next shift, and she'd already done the cold arithmetic of which meals she'd skip to stretch it. She had every reason in the world to keep her head down that night, to wipe the counter, count her drawer, and get on her bus. Nobody would have blamed her. Nobody would have ever known. The drowning don't expect a stranger to dive in. They've stopped expecting anything at all. But Keisha looked at the man at the end of the counter, at that terrible stillness, the stillness of someone who has run all the way out, and she heard her father's voice as clear as if he were standing at her shoulder, the thing he'd said to her 100 times growing up. You measure a person by how they treat someone who can't do a single thing for them, baby. Anybody can be good to the people who matter. The whole job is being good to the ones the world says don't. Her father had been dead 3 months, and in that moment, he was more alive in her than her own exhaustion. So Keisha Brooks, who had nothing, set down her rag and walked toward the man who had less. She could have left him alone. Most people would have. She had every excuse, her own grief, her own empty pockets, the long, cold bus ride still ahead of her. Instead, she did the thing her father had raised her to do. She poured him a coffee he hadn't ordered, set it in front of him, and said the words that, though neither of them knew it yet, were about to save a man's life and echo through both their futures for 6 years. You don't have to order anything, baby, she said gently. But you look like you could use someone to sit with for a minute, so I'm gonna sit. Daniel Whitfield Price, though he didn't give the name, didn't give anything, looked up at her with the hollow eyes of a man who had stopped believing anyone in the world would ever look at him again. And something in him, some last thin thread, held on. He started talking, slowly at first, then in a rush, the way the drowning grab a rope. He told her he'd lost his company, that he'd built something over 20 years and watched a partner and a market and his own pride burn it down in 18 months. He told her his wife had left, that he'd let everyone down, that the people he'd employed had lost their jobs because of his mistakes. He told her he had exactly nothing left. No money, no family, no reason. He didn't say the last part out loud. He didn't have to. Keisha had buried her father 3 months before. She knew exactly what a person looked like when they were standing at the door of the dark and reaching for the handle. And she had been heading home in 20 minutes. But she didn't go home in 20 minutes. She stayed. She made him a plate, a real one, eggs and hash and toast, ringing it up on her own tab because the register wasn't hers to give away from, and her tab was the tips she'd folded into her pocket that night. $40. It was, almost to the dollar, everything she had in the world until her next shift. It was her share of the rent on the rented room. It was 3 days of eating. She slid the plate in front of him and told him to eat. And when he tried to say he couldn't pay, she said, "It's already paid. Eat." And he ate like a man who hadn't in days, which he hadn't. She didn't crowd him. She wiped down the counter near him and let the quiet do some of the work, the way her father used to with the men he'd find sitting in their trucks too long in the lot. And slowly, the food and the warmth and the simple fact of another person not walking away loosened something in the stranger. And he began to talk. He told her he'd built a company over 20 years and lost it in 18 months. A bad partner, a worse market, his own pride. He told her his wife had left, that the people who'd worked for him had lost their jobs because of his mistakes, that he'd let down everyone who ever believed in him. He told her he was 44 years old and had nothing left and was nothing, that the world would be lighter without the weight of him in it. He didn't say the rest. He didn't have to. Keisha had buried her father 12 weeks before. She knew the exact shape of a person standing at the edge of giving up. Because some nights, she'd stood near it herself. She didn't argue with him. That was the thing. She didn't tell him he was wrong, didn't pile on bright words he'd never believe. She just sat down across from him, and she told him about her dad. "Lost my father in the fall," she said. "Best man I ever knew. Fixed boilers for a living, never had 2 nickels, and he was richer than anybody I've met since because of how he treated people." She turned her coffee cup. "He used to tell me the worst night of your life always feels like the last page. Always. That's the trick of it. It feels final because you can't see the next page yet, and you're sure there isn't one. But there almost always is. He said the only real mistake is closing the book on a chapter that wasn't actually the end." She looked at him steady. "You built something once. A man who built something once can build it again. But not from where you're thinking about going tonight. You can only build it from here. From one more day." The stranger's eyes filled. "You don't even know me." "I know you're a person sitting in front of me who's hurting," Keisha said simply. "That's the only part I need to know. My daddy taught me that too." While he ate, she talked. Not big speeches. Keisha didn't have big speeches. She told him about her father, 3 months gone. She told him that her daddy used to say, "A person isn't finished just because a chapter is. That the worst night of your life feels like the last page. But it almost never is. It just feels that way because you can't see the next one yet." "You built something once," she said. "A man who can build something once can build something twice. But not if he's not here to do it." She let that sit. "Whatever you came in here planning tonight, it can wait one more day. Just give it one more day. The world's not done with you. I can feel it." When the plate was empty and the shaking in his hands had finally stilled, Keisha did 2 more things. She took off her coat, a worn navy thing, the only warm coat she owned, the one that had to get her through that whole brutal winter, and she draped it over his soaked shoulders because he had no coat and the sleet outside was murder, and she would rather be cold on the bus than send a freezing man back out into a night like that. And then she took a paper napkin from the dispenser, and she borrowed a pen, and she wrote something on it, folded it once and pressed it into his hand. "Read it later," she said. "Not now, when you need it." Then her shift was over, and the next girl came on, and Keisha Brooks pulled her thin sweater tight and walked out into the cold toward the bus stop, and she never told him her name, and she never asked his. To her, it wasn't a story. It was just a Tuesday. It was just the thing you do when there's a drowning person in front of you, and you happen to have a hand. She nearly froze at that bus stop. That was the part she'd remember, the only part. Not that she'd done something noble, but that she'd been so cold without her coat that she'd stamped her feet for 20 minutes and regretted giving it away a little, the human way. You regret a kindness while you're paying for it. On the long ride home, she pressed her face to the dark window and let herself cry, the way she did most nights that winter, for her father, for the apartment she'd lost, for the $40 she no longer had, and the 3 days she'd now have to stretch on almost nothing. She did the math in her head, toast, the cheap rice, skip lunch Thursday, and she did not once think she'd done anything that mattered. She'd given a sad man a meal. People did that. Her father would have done it without thinking, would have been ashamed of her if she hadn't. By the next week, she'd half forgotten him. That's the thing about real kindness, the thing this whole story turns on. The person giving it almost never knows what it weighs. Keisha went on with her hard, narrow life. She got back on her feet, slow and stubborn, the way she did everything. She found steadier work, eventually, at a diner called Rosie's. She brought her mother in when the stairs got to be too much. The man with no coat became, if she thought of him at all, just a face from a bad winter, a stranger she hoped had made it. She had no idea she'd handed him the rest of his life. You almost never do. You drop the stone in the water, and you walk away before you ever see the ring it makes. She did not know, could not have known, that the man had not come in off the street that night by accident, that he had been walking in the sleet with no coat and no plan but one, toward the river bridge at the edge of town, that the diner's warm light had been, to him, the last ordinary thing he meant to see. He had sat down at that counter to get out of the cold for 10 minutes before he finished what he'd come out to do, and a broke, grieving waitress had poured him a coffee he didn't order, and given him her last $40 and the coat off her back, and told him the world wasn't done with him. He did not go to the bridge that night. He stood outside the diner in her navy coat, and he unfolded the napkin under the streetlight, and he read 7 words written in a tired woman's careful hand. Not tonight. The world still needs you. And Daniel Price, who would not say that name to anyone for a long time, who had nothing and no one and had been 30 minutes from gone, put the napkin in his pocket and pulled the coat tighter and turned away from the river and walked back toward a life he had been about to throw away. He kept the coat, he kept the napkin, and he made himself a promise that night that would take him 6 years to keep, that if he ever climbed back, if he ever became anything again, he was going to find the woman who didn't know her own name had become the most important name in his life. It did not happen fast. Climbing out never does. Daniel started where you start when you've lost everything. At the bottom, with a borrowed laptop in a cheaper-than-cheap room, with the navy coat hung on the back of the door where he could see it. On the hard mornings, the ones where the old dark crept back in, he would read the 7 words on the napkin again. Not tonight. The world still needs you. He didn't fully believe it, but she had believed it. A stranger with nothing, enough to give him her last $40, and he found he could not bring himself to make a liar out of the only person who'd been kind to him at the end of the world. So he got up, and he tried again. He had one idea left, a good one, the kind he'd been too proud and too busy to chase in his first life. This time, he had nothing but time and nothing left to lose, and it turned out those are the exact conditions in which good ideas grow. It was brutal at the start. He worked nights stocking a warehouse to eat, while he built the thing on a borrowed laptop in the dark. There were mornings the old weight came back so heavy he couldn't get off the floor of that rented room. And on those mornings, he did the only thing he had. He looked at the napkin, read the 7 words, and made himself sit up. The first person he hired, once there was barely enough to hire anyone, was a man he'd met in the unemployment line. A machinist twice his age that nobody else would touch because of a gap in his work history. Daniel hired him precisely because nobody else would, because a woman in a diner had once done the same for him. That machinist is a vice president now. The idea became a product. The product became a company. And over 6 hard years, Daniel Price built something far larger than the thing he had lost. And this time, he built it differently because he had learned on a diner stool at 2 a.m. what the first version of him never understood, that the measure of a man is how he treats the person who can't do a single thing for him. His company paid its lowest workers more than the law required, and its janitors knew his name, and he knew theirs. People called it a strange way to run a business. It made him richer than the old way ever had. He never bothered explaining that he hadn't learned it in business school. He'd learned it from a stranger who gave him her last $40. The business journalists who wrote him up could never quite explain the turnaround. They wrote about his instinct for talent, his contrarian culture, the way his best people never left and his customers were almost fanatically loyal. What none of them understood was that it all came down to a single rule Daniel ran everything by, a rule he never put in a slide deck because it would have sounded soft. Never walk past a person you could help. He hired the people other companies discarded. The gap in the resume, the second chance, the ones the world had written off. And it turned out the written off were the most loyal, most driven workforce a man could ask for. Because they remembered, the way Daniel remembered, what it felt like to be invisible. He built an empire out of the simple, radical idea that the people everyone overlooked were a fortune lying in plain sight. He'd gotten that idea too, from a waitress in a diner, though he never told the reporters that part either. He had more money than he could spend, and a comeback the whole city admired, and there was exactly one hole in it that no amount of either could fill. He had never been able to say thank you to the one person who made all of it possible. It sat in him like an unpaid debt, year after year. He didn't want to die, and he understood now, with the clarity of a man who'd come back from the edge, exactly how precious that sentence was, without finding her. So, he kept looking, and he kept the coat by the door. By 2026 he was, by the cold arithmetic of the world, one of the most powerful men in the city. His name was on a building. Reporters asked him for the secret of his comeback, and he gave them the polished version, the one about resilience and second chances. And he never once told them the true version, because the true version belonged to a woman whose name he didn't know. But there was a thing about Daniel Price that none of those reporters knew. In his enormous glass office, behind his desk, there hung a worn navy coat, a cheap woman's coat, out of place among all that money, that his assistants had learned never to move. And framed on the wall, where most men hang their diplomas and their magazine covers, was a paper napkin with 7 words on it. For 6 years he had been looking for her. He'd hired people. He'd remembered the diner, but it had closed and been sold, and the records were gone. The staff had scattered. Nobody could tell him the name of the closing shift waitress from a winter 6 years back. Lead after lead went cold. He never stopped. He kept the coat ready, and he kept the promise, and he told himself that one day a thread would finally catch. And then, on an ordinary week in 2026, one finally did. By then the search had become almost a private religion. For 6 years, every time Daniel could spare the resources, he'd pointed them at the same question. Who was the waitress? The diner had closed in 2021 and been gutted and turned into a phone store. The owner had died. The payroll records were a casualty of a bankruptcy filing, boxes that no longer existed. The other staff had scattered across 3 states and changed numbers and last names. Daniel had chased a dozen leads that dead-ended in nothing. A name that turned out wrong, a woman in another city who'd never worked there, a trail that simply stopped. Each dead end cost him something, because each one was a door closing on the one debt he most needed to pay. His own people had gently suggested more than once that he let it go, that he'd done well, that the woman probably never thought about it, that he could honor her by paying it forward to strangers and calling it square. Daniel refused every time. You don't understand, he told them. She didn't pay it forward to a stranger. She paid it to me, specifically, on the specific night I'd decided to stop existing. I'm not paying a debt to humanity in general. I'm finding her. He kept the coat on the door and the napkin on the wall, and he did not quit, the way she had not quit on him. It came from the most ordinary place. Daniel's investigator had spent years chasing the closed diner's paper trail and getting nowhere. But people are not paper, and people remember kindness. The break came when they finally tracked down an old line cook who'd worked that same winter, a man named Hector, who now ran a food truck across town. Daniel went himself. He always went himself now. And when he described the closing shift waitress from the winter of 2020, quiet, generous, gave away free coffee, had just lost her father. Hector's face changed. Keisha, he said. Keisha Brooks. Man, everybody loved that girl. She'd give you the shirt off her back. Literally, I saw her do it. He shook his head. Last I heard, she's still in town. Works over at Rosie's off the highway. Takes care of her mama, I think. Always taking care of somebody. Daniel Price stood in a parking lot, holding a name he'd spent 6 years and a fortune chasing, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. Keisha Brooks. The most important person in his life had a name, and it was Keisha Brooks, and she was 11 miles away, pouring coffee. He could have sent a check. He could have sent a team, a lawyer, a press release. That was how his world usually said thank you, at a distance, with money, cleanly. But Daniel had learned something on a diner stool 6 years before about what it means to actually show up for a person. And he was not going to thank the woman who showed up for him by sending a stranger with an envelope. He was going to go himself. He was going to look her in the eye. He took the navy coat off the back of his office door and the framed napkin off the wall, and he had his driver point the car toward a diner off the highway. What Daniel didn't know, what made the timing of it almost unbearable, was that he was arriving on the single worst day of Keisha Brooks's life since the winter they had met. Because while he drove across town to repay a 6-year-old kindness, Keisha was running out of road. The eviction notice had come on Monday. 30 days. Pearl had had a bad spell on Tuesday. Chest tight, lips going dusky. A frightening hour in the ER that ended with a new prescription Keisha already knew she couldn't afford, and a doctor saying the words, "She really shouldn't be missing doses." That ER hour had nearly broken Keisha. She'd sat in the molded plastic chair holding her mother's hand, while the monitors did their frightening math, and she'd done her own math underneath it. The cost of the ambulance she had argued against and lost, the new medication, the day of work she was missing right now sitting here, the rent she already couldn't make. She'd kept her face calm for Pearl, smiled, said, "It's just a tune-up, Mama. They're taking good care of you," while inside she was a woman watching the floor open up. And the worst part, the part that sat in Keisha's chest like a stone, was the look on her mother's face, because Pearl knew. Pearl had spent 62 years reading her daughter, and she knew exactly what that calm smile was hiding. On the ride home, Pearl had said quietly, looking out the window, "Baby, I'm costing you everything. I see it. Maybe it'd be easier on you if I just..." And Keisha had cut her off so fast and so fierce that her mother stopped. "Don't you ever finish that sentence," Keisha had said. "Not ever, you hear me? You spent your whole life giving to me. There is no number, Mama. There is no amount of money or work or anything in this world that makes you a burden. You're my mother. Carrying you isn't the hard part of my life. You're the reason I can carry the rest of it." She'd gripped the wheel and blinked hard. "We're going to be fine. I'll figure it out. I always figure it out." She didn't know how she'd figure it out. That was the thing. For the first time in her life, sitting in that bathroom Thursday morning with the water running, Keisha Brooks could not see the next page. The very thing she'd promised a stranger 6 years ago always existed. She believed it for everybody else. She just couldn't find it for herself. By Wednesday, the pharmacy had stopped being gentle about the balance, and through all of it, Keisha kept her face calm for her mother, because that was the one thing she could still give. The performance that everything was handled, that her girl had it under control so that Pearl could rest instead of worry herself sicker. But that morning, before her shift, Keisha had sat in the bathroom with the door closed and the water running so her mother wouldn't hear, and she had finally, quietly, run out. Not out of life. Keisha Brooks had too much steel in her for that, and too much love. Her mother needed her, and a woman with someone to take care of does not get to fall apart, but out of road, out of ideas, out of the belief, the one her father had given her, that if you just keep doing right by people, somehow it comes back around. She'd done right by everybody her whole life. She'd given and given and given. And here she was, at 34, with a sick mother, an eviction notice, an empty account, and a manager who thought free coffee for a tired trucker was a firing offense. "I don't know what I did wrong, Daddy," she whispered to a man 3 years in the ground. "I did it the way you taught me. I gave when I had nothing, and I've got nothing to show for it, but more nothing." Then she dried her face, and she fixed her smile back on, and she kissed her mother's forehead and told her she'd bring home something good for dinner. And she caught the bus to Rosie's to work a shift she didn't know was about to be her last, and to be standing exactly where she needed to be standing when the answer to 20 years of giving finally came looking for her. She didn't know the universe was about to settle a debt. She just knew her feet hurt and her heart was heavy and the lunch rush was starting. The thing that set Greg Dolan off was, of course, a kindness. There was a regular named Earl, an old man on a fixed check who came in most afternoons and nursed a single cup of coffee for an hour because his apartment was lonely and cold. Keisha always kept his cup full and never charged him for the refills, and sometimes, on days she could, she'd accidentally ring up a short stack he hadn't ordered and slide it in front of him. It cost the diner almost nothing. It was the whole reason Earl was still eating most days. That afternoon, Earl was a few dollars short, even for the one coffee, embarrassed, counting change with shaking hands, and Keisha did what she always did, waved it off, told him it was on her, topped him up. Greg Dolan saw it from the register. He'd been looking for a reason, and now he had his show. He came out from behind the counter loud in front of the full lunch crowd, and he made an example of her, said she'd been stealing by giving away product, said the diner wasn't a soup kitchen for every bum who wanders in, said this was exactly the problem with her, that she gave away things that weren't hers to give, that she didn't understand business, that the place needed people who could tell the difference between customers and charity cases. Earl shrank into his seat, mortified, clutching his quarters, and that, not the insult to herself, but the old man being humiliated for being poor, was the only thing that made Keisha's chin come up. "He's 81, Mr. Dolan," she said quietly. "A cup of coffee isn't going to sink this place. But if it's a firing offense to make sure an old man isn't cold and alone for 1 hour a day, then I guess you'd better fire me." So he did. Loud, in front of everyone, the way this story began. "Take off the apron and get out. People come here to eat, not to be served by charity cases." And Keisha Brooks, with 30 days to vacate and a sick mother at home, and not $1 of cushion in the world, untied her apron and folded it on the counter and kept her head up, because the one thing they could never fire her out of was the way her father raised her. She squeezed Earl's shoulder on her way past, told him to take care, and walked the length of the silent diner toward the door, every eye on her, her face burning and her back straight. She reached for the door handle, and the door opened from the other side, and a tall man in a charcoal coat stepped through it, and Keisha stepped back to let him pass, the way a good waitress does even on her way out the door, and the man stopped dead in the entrance, staring at her face like he'd seen a ghost, and went absolutely white. Keisha didn't know him. Why would she? The man in front of her was polished, expensive, powerful, the kind of man who turned heads in a room like this. The man she'd fed 6 years ago had been soaked and shattered and at the end of the world. 6 years, and a whole resurrection stood between those two faces. She gave him the small, automatic smile of a woman leaving a job and murmured, "Excuse me," and moved a step around him and out into the rest of her collapsing life. He didn't move. He couldn't. Daniel Price stood in the doorway of Rosie's diner and looked at the face that had visited him in his worst dreams and his best ones for 6 years. The face of the only person who'd been kind to him at the bottom of the world, and he watched her try to leave, and he saw the folded apron on the counter, and he heard the tail end of what was happening here, and he put it together in one terrible instant. The woman who'd given him her last $40 was being thrown out the door for giving an old man a free cup of coffee. "Wait," he said. His voice came out rough. "Please, don't go." Keisha paused, confused. Greg Dolan, scenting a customer, and clearly an important one, slid into his oily customer service voice. "Sir, I apologize for the disturbance. We're just letting an employee go. It won't affect your—" "Be quiet." Daniel didn't even look at him. He was still staring at Keisha, and his eyes had gone wet, and his voice shook in a way that made the whole diner go still all over again. "Ma'am, I have to ask you something, and I need you to think back. 6 years ago, a diner on the North End, the closing shift, the middle of winter. A man came in with no coat. You fed him. You gave him everything in your pocket. He had to stop and breathe. You wrote something on a napkin and told him the world still needed him." Keisha's hand came up slowly to her mouth. And Greg Dolan, sensing the ground shifting under his feet, but not yet understanding how far he was about to fall, made the mistake of opening his mouth one more time. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but she's been let go, so if you've got business, it's not with." Daniel Price finally turned and looked at him, and every person in that diner watched the most powerful man most of them would ever see in person fix a small, cruel manager with a stare that could strip paint and say, very quietly, "You just fired the woman who saved my life. So, before you say one more word, do you have the slightest idea who you've been talking to?" It hit Keisha then, not all at once, in pieces. The shape of his shoulders, something in the eyes that the 6 good years hadn't changed. The diner, the winter, the napkin. The man she'd sat with at 2 in the morning, the soaked stranger she'd given her coat to and never seen again, the one she'd thought about sometimes over the years and hoped, in a vague way, had made it. She'd never known if he had. You don't, usually. You do the kindness and you let it go, and you never learn how the story ended. "It was you," she breathed, "the man with no coat, in the sleet. You made it." For a moment, neither of them was in a diner off the highway in the 2026. They were both back in that empty all-night place 6 years gone. 2 people at the bottom of their lives, keeping each other company over a plate of eggs. Keisha had wondered about him, now and then, over the years. On the hard nights especially, she'd think about the stranger and hope, in a vague, helpless way, that he'd found his next page. You do that when you've been kind to someone and then lost them to the current of the world. You carry a small open question for them, forever, and you never expect an answer. And here, impossibly, was the answer, standing in a charcoal coat with tears on his face, more alive than she could have dared to imagine. "I used to wonder if you were okay," she said softly. "I never knew your name. I'd think about you sometimes and just hope." "I had your name memorized as 7 words," Daniel said, "for 6 years. His voice was wrecked. "Do you understand what you did? You didn't just feed a hungry man. You stopped at the exact edge of the exact night for a stranger who couldn't give you one single thing back when you were grieving your own father and down to your last $40. People don't do that, Keisha. Almost nobody does that. And you did it like it was nothing, like it was just a Tuesday." "It was just a Tuesday," Keisha said, and a wet laugh broke out of her. "It really was." "It was the most important Tuesday of my life," Daniel said. "I made it." Daniel's composure cracked straight down the middle, the polished billionaire gone, and underneath was just the man she'd fed. "I made it because of you. I have been looking for you for 6 years, Keisha Brooks. 6 years. And I walk in here today, and they're throwing you out the door for being exactly the person who saved me." The diner was dead silent. Greg Dolan had gone the color of old paper. Earl, the old man, had stood up at his booth. Phones were coming out. And here is where the story almost went a very different way. Because Keisha Brooks did something nobody expected. She took a step back. If you've ever been too proud to take help even when you were drowning, stay with me, because what she does next and what he does about it is the whole heart of this thing. Drop a comment, hit that subscribe button, and let's finish it. "No," Keisha said. Her voice was shaking, but her eyes were clear. "No, I'm glad you made it. You don't know how glad. But I didn't do it for this. I didn't sit with you that night so that one day you'd show up rich and..." She gestured at his coat, his car out the window, all of it, "and pay me back. That's not what it was. If I take something from you now, it turns the best thing I ever did into a transaction. And I've got so little left, mister, that I can't afford to lose that too. So I'm glad. I really am. But I don't want your money." And she turned again for the door, because that was Keisha Brooks all the way down. A woman who had given from empty her whole life and could not, even drowning, even with an eviction notice in her purse, make herself reach out a hand and take. Her pride was the last thing she owned outright. She wasn't going to sell it, not even to the man she'd saved. Daniel watched her reach for the handle a second time, and he understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had exactly one move left, and it wasn't money, and it wasn't words. He reached into the bag he was carrying. "Keisha, wait, please, I'm not here to pay you back. You're right, you can't pay that back. Money can't touch what you did." His voice broke. I kept something for 6 years. I need you to see it before you walk out that door. And then, if you still want to go, I'll drive you home myself and never bother you again." She stopped, she turned, and Daniel Price lifted, out of the bag, a worn navy coat, her coat. The cheap navy one she'd draped over a freezing stranger's shoulders 6 years ago and never expected to see again. It was clean, cared for, a little faded, a coat that had clearly been kept somewhere safe for a very long time. "You kept it," Keisha whispered. "It hung on the back of my office door for 6 years, Daniel said. "Every morning I saw it, on the bad mornings, and there were a lot of bad mornings, climbing back. I'd look at it and remember that a woman who had nothing gave me this when I had less than nothing. It's the reason there's a company, it's the reason there's a me." And then, with hands that weren't quite steady, he drew out the other thing, a paper napkin, pressed flat inside a frame, 6 years old, the ink a little faded, but the careful handwriting still clear. He didn't have to read it, but he read it anyway, out loud, for the whole silent diner to hear, his voice cracking on the words. "Not tonight. The world still needs you." "I was on my way to the river that night, Keisha." He said it simply, gently, the way you say the truest, hardest things. "I'd already decided. The diner was just somewhere warm to sit for 10 minutes first. And a waitress who looked like she was carrying the whole world herself poured me a coffee I didn't order and gave me her last $40, and the coat off her back, and 7 words on a napkin." He held the frame like it was made of glass. "I didn't go to the river. I went home, and I read this every day until I believed it. You didn't give me a coat and a meal. You gave me the next 6 years of my life. You gave me every single thing I've built and every good thing I've done since. And you did it for a stranger, for free, on the worst night of your own life. And then you walked away and never even told me your name." The diner had stopped breathing. Earl was crying openly. A young waitress had her hand pressed to her mouth. And Greg Dolan stood frozen at the register, beginning, finally, to understand the size of what he'd done. That he had just publicly fired for the crime of giving away a cup of coffee the woman who had once given a dying man her whole world. Nobody in that diner moved. The lunch crowd that had, 10 minutes ago, watched a manager humiliate a waitress and said nothing. The same crowd that goes silent in every story like this, that looks at its plate while someone gets crushed, was not silent now. They were riveted, and more than a few of them were ashamed, recognizing themselves in the part where everyone watches and no one helps. A woman 2 booths over was crying into her napkin. A trucker had taken off his cap. Earl stood by his table with both hands pressed to his mouth, because he understood, better than anyone, that the woman being honored had been fired for a kindness she had done to him. And Keisha stood in the middle of it and felt 6 years rearrange themselves. She had spent those years believing the worst thing about the world, that you give and it disappears and nothing comes back. She had said it out loud that very morning in a running water bathroom to her dead father. "I gave when I had nothing, and I've got nothing to show for it." And here was her answer, 6 years late, walking and breathing and weeping in a charcoal coat, the proof that the thing she'd thrown into the dark had not vanished at all. It had become a man. It had become a company. It had come all the way back around to find her on the exact day she needed it most. "So you can tell me you don't want my money," Daniel said, turning back to Keisha, and now there was something fierce under the tears. "And you're right, I can't pay you back, and I won't insult you by trying, but I am not going to stand here and watch the most generous person I have ever met get thrown out into the cold for being exactly that. Not while I have breath, and not while I have the means to do something about it. You showed up for me when you had nothing. Let me show up for you, not as payment, as what people who love each other do." Keisha Brooks, who had not let herself cry in that bathroom that morning, who had held the smile for her mother, who had kept her chin up all the way out the door, finally broke, right there in the middle of Rosie's diner, and Daniel Price stepped forward and caught her, the way she'd once caught him. Then he turned to Greg Dolan. He didn't shout. Men with real power rarely have to. "What's your name?" Dolan stammered it out. "Mr. Dolan, you fired this woman for giving an 81-year-old man a cup of coffee." Daniel let that hang in front of the whole diner. "I happen to be looking for things to invest in. I think I'll start by buying this diner. It shouldn't take much. Places like this run thin. He took out his phone, made one short call to a man who answered on the first ring, said a few quiet numbers, and put it away. It really was that easy when you were Daniel Price. I'll own it by the end of the week, and my first decision as owner is that you're done here. Not because you embarrassed me, because of how you treat people who can't do anything for you. That's the only test that's ever mattered, and you failed it in front of 40 witnesses. Greg Dolan opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and closed it. He took off his own manager's name tag, set it on the counter next to Keisha's folded apron, and left to a silence louder than any words. Earl, the old man, started to clap, and then the whole diner did. And of course, half the diner had been filming, in a room where a billionaire walks in and kneels, figuratively, before a fired waitress and tells the whole place she once saved his life. The phones had come out the moment the air changed. By that evening, the clip was everywhere. The tall man in the charcoal coat holding up a worn navy coat, the frame napkin, the 7 words read aloud, the waitress breaking down, the manager slinking out. Strangers all over the country watched it and wept and sent it to the people they loved. The comments filled with their own stories. The bus driver who'd once talked someone down, the nurse who'd paid for a stranger's prescription, the teacher who'd quietly fed a hungry kid for a year. Keisha's small, forgotten Tuesday kindness had become, overnight, a mirror the whole internet was using to look at its own buried decency. Keisha didn't want any of that. She found it mortifying, frankly, but Daniel told her something that afternoon that changed how she carried it. "You spent 6 years thinking that kindness disappeared into the dark," he said. "It didn't. It built all this. Let people see where it went. Maybe it talks somebody else off their own bridge tonight, just by reminding them that one stranger can matter that much. And that, the idea that her story might do for a stranger what her coffee had done for him, was the only argument that could have made Keisha Brooks say yes. But Keisha didn't want the diner. That was the thing Daniel understood about her now. She didn't want to be handed her old job back like a consolation prize. She wanted what every person like her wants, and almost never gets, a chance, and to be seen. So he didn't offer her the job. Over coffee in that same diner, an hour later, he offered her something else, and he was careful to offer it as a partner and not a patron. "I don't want to rescue you, Keisha," he said. "You'd hate that, and you'd be right to. I want to work with you, because the thing you have, the thing that made you stop for a stranger on the worst night of your life, that's the rarest thing there is, and I have spent 6 years around powerful people who don't have a drop of it." He turned his cup in his hands. "But first, before any of that, your mother. You mentioned your mother. Tell me about your mother." And Keisha, who never asked anyone for anything, looked at the man whose life she'd saved, and finally, for the first time in years, let herself accept a hand. She told him about Pearl. It moved fast after that. The way things move when someone with means finally points them at a problem that actually matters. Pearl Brooks saw the specialist that week, the real one, the one with the months-long wait list, and got on the medication that worked instead of the one Keisha could almost afford. Keisha would remember the afternoon she told her mother. She'd come home braced to deliver more bad news, the way she always was. And instead, she sat on the edge of Pearl's bed and told her the good doctor, the real medicine, the rent handled, all of it. And she told her why, the whole story, the winter, the stranger, the coat, the napkin, the man who'd spent 6 years looking. Pearl listened with her hand over her mouth, and when it was done, she didn't say anything about the money at all. She just took her daughter's face in both her hands, the way she had when Keisha was small, and she said, "Your father is up there right now telling everybody who'll listen. You know that? That's my girl. That's my Keisha. I taught her that." And the two of them held each other and cried in a apartment that, for the first time in 2 years, didn't have a notice on the door. Cried the good kind of tears, the kind that come when a weight you've carried so long you forgot it was. A weight is finally lifted off. Months later, stronger than she'd been in years, Pearl would tell Keisha that she'd nearly given up that hard winter, that she'd hated being a burden so much. There'd been nights she prayed not to wake up and add another day to her daughter's load. "And then, you wouldn't let me say it," Pearl said. "You said carrying me wasn't the hard part of your life. I held on to that baby. You saved me with that, same as that man says you saved him. You don't even know how many people you've kept here just by refusing to let them feel like nothing." The eviction notice came off the door. Daniel had quietly handled the back rent. And when Keisha started to protest, he said only, "You spent your last $40 on me when you had a sick mother at home. Let me get the rent. We'll call it even on the 40. The rest we'll figure out as partners." She let him. It was, she realized, the hardest and best thing she'd done in years, to let someone show up for her, the way she'd always shown up for everyone else. It took a few more conversations before Keisha said yes to the bigger thing, and she only said yes on her own terms. They sat in a booth at Rosie's, of all places, a week later, 2 coffees between them, and Daniel laid out what he was thinking, and Keisha listened with her arms folded and her guard up, because she'd learned the hard way that when rich people get excited about helping, the help usually came with strings or cameras, or a version of her they'd invented that wasn't really her. "I don't want to be your good deed," she told him flatly. "I've seen how that goes. You write a check, you feel good, there's a photo, and the people you helped are still right where they were once the cameras leave." "Then don't be my good deed," Daniel said. "Be my partner, real equity, your name, not mine, on the thing. You run it, you make the calls, I write the checks, and stay out of your way. I had the second life. I don't know what to do with it. You know exactly what to do with it. You've been doing it your whole life for free. I just want to give you a budget." Keisha was quiet a long moment. "It has to actually reach people," she said finally. "Not a gala, not a building with my name in gold. The bus stations, the all-night places, the ones nobody's looking at. That's where I was. That's where you were." "That's the whole idea," Daniel said. "And the people who work it get paid right," she said. "No, do it for the cause nonsense. The folks on the front line are the cause." "Yes." "And my mother," Keisha said, and her voice caught for the first time, "gets to see it, while she's still here to see it." "Your mother," Daniel said gently, "is going to be in the front row." And that was the moment Keisha Brooks finally uncrossed her arms. The partnership turned out to be real, and it turned out to be the thing Daniel had needed as much as Keisha had. Because Daniel Price had money and reach and no idea anymore what to do with the second chance a stranger had given him. And Keisha Brooks had the rarest instinct in the world for the exact moment a person is about to go under. So they built something together. They called it the $40 Fund. It was a simple thing, stubborn and practical, the kind of help that actually reaches people. It put money and a warm meal and a human being into the all-night places where the desperate end up at 2 a.m. The diners, the bus stations, the shelters, the crisis lines. It trained ordinary workers, waitresses, and night clerks and drivers to notice the person at the end of the counter with the particular stillness, and to do the smallest, most powerful thing there is: sit down and stay. Because Daniel knew, better than anyone alive, that sometimes the whole difference between a man going home and a man going to the river is one stranger who pours a coffee. Nobody ordered and says, "You don't have to be alone for this." The day they opened the first office, they did it not in some glass tower, but in a storefront, a block from a bus station, where the people who needed it actually were. And the room that gathered for it told you everything about the strange, beautiful chain a single Tuesday had set off. Pearl was there in the front, in her good dress, crying happily and telling a reporter, I always knew my girl was going to do something." Hector, the line cook turned food truck owner, whose memory had cracked the whole case open, came and stood at the back grinning, and Daniel made sure everyone knew that, without Hector, none of them would be standing there. Earl, the 81-year-old man whose free cup of coffee had gotten Keisha fired, sat in the second row, in the only tie he owned, and when Keisha caught his eye, she mouthed, thank you, because it was his coffee in the end that had kept her in that diner the exact minute Daniel walked through the door. Daniel spoke first, briefly, and he did the thing he'd promised himself. He told the real story. Not the polished comeback story he gave the magazines, but the true one. He stood up in front of the cameras, a man worth more than most of them could count, and he said plainly, 6 years ago, I had decided to stop living. A waitress I'd never met fed me with her last $40 and gave me her coat and wrote 7 words on a napkin. And she has no idea, to this day, that she is the only reason I'm standing here. Everything I've built, every job my company created, every dollar in this fund, all of it traces back to one stranger deciding I was worth 10 minutes of her time on the worst night of her own life. He had to stop. The room was silent. I spent 6 years looking for her so I could say thank you. I couldn't find a way to pay it back, so we built this instead, a way to pay it on. That's all this is, one stranger sitting down with another and refusing to walk past. Then he stepped aside, because it was never going to be his name on the door, and he handed it to the woman it belonged to. Keisha ran it. Of course she ran it. She was, it turned out, magnificent at it. Not as a charity boss in an office, but out there, at the counters, finding the ones nobody else saw, the way someone had once found her father's lessons living in her. There was a young man, that first winter, call him Marcus, 19, working a graveyard shift at a gas station the fund had partnered with, one of the ordinary workers Keisha had trained to notice. A woman came in at 3 a.m, soaked, no coat, that particular stillness about her. 6 years earlier, Marcus wouldn't have known what he was looking at. Now he did. He didn't make a speech. He poured her a coffee she hadn't ordered and slid over one of the little cards the fund had printed, and he sat down on his break and said, "You don't have to talk, but you don't have to be alone for this either." And he stayed. That woman went home that night. She's alive right now. She will probably never know that she was saved by a chain that started with a grieving waitress and $40 on a winter night, years before she ever walked into that gas station. That was the whole point. That was what Keisha and Daniel had built. Not a charity, but a relay. Kindness handed from stranger to stranger to stranger. Each one never knowing the full distance the thing they did would travel. Keisha kept account, quietly, of the people the fund reached. She never told the press the number. She'd just look at it some nights and think of a man with no coat and a napkin and her father's voice. And she'd go home to her mother. 2 years on, the shape of Keisha Brooks's life had changed in ways that the woman crying in that bathroom on the worst morning of her life could never have imagined. She and Pearl had a real home now, a small, bright place with no eviction notice ever again. And Pearl, stronger, steadier, scolding Keisha for working too hard, got to wake up every day and watch her daughter do the thing she was born for. The fund had grown past one city. Keisha trained the workers herself, and she told every single one of them the same thing on their first day. The thing her father had told her. You measure a person by how they treat someone who can't do a thing for them. She'd become, without ever meaning to, exactly the kind of person who finds the invisible. At scale now, in a dozen cold cities, at 102 AM counters. She and Daniel stayed close, not romance, something steadier than that. The bond of two people who had each saved the other's life on a winter night 6 years apart. He came to Sunday dinners. Pearl adopted him outright and bossed him like a son. And once a year, on the anniversary of the night they met, the two of them would go quietly to that same kind of all-night diner and order 2 coffees and sit and not say very much, because some things between two people don't need words. Earl came to the fund's first anniversary in a new tie the fund had bought him, and he was not lonely anymore. Keisha had seen to that, the way she saw to everything. The navy coat still hangs in Daniel's office. The napkin hangs in Keisha's, where she can read it on the hard days, the ones that still come, because life doesn't stop being life just because it gets better. Not tonight. The world still needs you. She believes it now. For herself, finally, and not just for everybody else. Her mother, Pearl, stronger now on the medication that worked, came to the ribbon cutting in a good dress and cried the whole time and told everyone who'd listen that she always knew her girl was going to do something in this world. And Daniel kept the navy coat. He gave Keisha the framed napkin, though. Those 7 words belonged with her now. She hung it where she'd see it every morning, in an office she never once dreamed she'd have, doing work she was put on this earth to do. So, let me ask you something before you go. You will never know, most of the time, what your small kindness does after it leaves your hands. Keisha Brooks poured a coffee for a stranger on the worst night of her life, and then walked out into the cold and forgot about it, the way you forget a Tuesday. And that cup of coffee built a company and saved a man, and came back 6 years later to lift her own dying mother off the floor. She had no idea. You almost never do. The kindness you give away today disappears into a stranger's life, and you go home, and you never learn that it was the thing that kept them here. That's not a reason to give less. It's the reason to give more, to give like Keisha, from empty with no expectation to the person who can't do a single thing for you on the days you can least afford it. Because you cannot see the ripple, and you cannot know whose worst night you are standing in the middle of, and the smallest thing you do, a coffee, a coat, a minute of sitting down instead of walking past, might be the 7 words somebody reads under a streetlight that turn them back from the edge of everything. So, here's what I want from you tonight. Be the stranger in the diner. Notice the person at the end of the counter. Give the thing it costs you something to give. You will probably never find out what it did. Do it anyway. If Keisha and Daniel's story moved you, tell me in the comments about a stranger who was kind to you once when you needed it, or a time your own small kindness came back around. Hit that like button so more people find this story, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. Because you never know which $40, which coffee, which 7 words is the one that saves a life. Take care of each other. The world still needs you. And I'll see you in the next story.